Chapter 31, Saturday, September 21st to Sunday, September 22nd, 1776. The fire raged with inconceivable violence, and in its destruction, progress swept away all the buildings between Broad Street and the North River. Several women and children perished in the fire, their shrieks joined to the roaring of the flames, the crash of falling houses, and the widespread ruin which everywhere appeared formed a scene of horror great beyond description, and which was still heightened by the darkness of the night. The New York Mercury newspaper. I awoke coughing so hard I near brought up my supper. When I finally caught my breath, I smelled the smoke and saw the light, bright as day, outside my window. I jumped from my bed and peered out. It was not morning. It was an inferno. Flames curled out of all the windows next door. The rooftop beyond that was a lake of fire. Every building in sight was burning. The air was filled with crackling and popping sounds, with shrieks and screams coming from the street below. A hot gust of wind blew the curtains back and sent the fire straight at me. Fiery shingles floated from the roof and caught in the branches of the tree outside my window, setting the bark ablaze. A burning leaf drifted to the sill. I quickly brushed it off, my hands quivering. Get out! Seized again by coughing, I fell to the ground where the smoke was not so heavy. I pulled my shoes towards me and quickly buckled them on, then took a deep breath, rose to my feet, grabbed Ruth's doll off my bed, and opened the door. Smoke filled the hall, curling down from the ceiling along with fingers of fire. Get out now! I clattered down the stairs, screaming, Fire! Fire! The door to Lady Seymour's bedchamber was just opening. As I went to pass by, she grabbed my arm. Quick, child! She cried, Help me! Her chamber was even brighter than the attic, but the windows were closed and the smoke thinner. She bent over an enormous trunk by the wall. It contains my valuables. She pulled a handle. Please, Isabel. I reached for the handle and tugged. The trunk did not move. It's too heavy, ma'am. Leave it. The roof is afire. No, wait. She flung open the top. The trunk was filled with a silver tea set, a small portrait of a yellow-haired man, something wrapped in velvet cloth, dusty sacks, small wooden boxes, and packets of letters tied in a ribbon. There was another crash outside and screams. I grabbed her arm. We'll die if we stay. She pulled out the letters and two small boxes and thrust them at me, along with the portrait. Take these. I stuck the portrait and letters in my pocket and balanced Ruth's doll on top of the boxes in my arms. The room was so hot I thought the corn husks might explode into flames. Lady Seymour grabbed two of the sacks. The coins within clinked together as she rose to her feet, coughing. Hurry! She gasped. The smoke in the hall was thicker than it had been moments before. We felt our way, one step at a time, to the staircase. I went down first, with the lady behind me, her frail hand on my shoulder. My eyes watered. My lungs felt like they were pulling in flames. I thought for a moment we were trapped. The thick haze tricked my mind, and I knew not if we should proceed down or up. My ears filled with the crackle of burning wood. Help me! Lady Seymour cried. Her hand vanished. Ma'am? Ma'am? The smoke stopped up my throat. There was a thunderous crash overhead, a ceiling giving way or a piece of the roof collapsing. The old woman had crumpled to the stairs. Is she dead? I put my hand on her chest. Her heartbeat was light and fast as a bird's wings beating against a cage. I put my face close to hers and screamed, Get up! She moaned once and tried to move her hand. I pulled her arm. She moaned again, but I could not be gentle. I dropped the boxes and doll, draped her arm around me, and half fell down the rest of the stairs. Once on the ground floor, she tried to walk, but one of her legs was failing her. I opened the front door and dragged the two of us out to the street. The air was a swirl with flame, soot, and burning shingles, each caught in a devilish whirlwind. The cries and screams of men and women mixed with the terror of the horses burning alive in locked stables. Windows exploded, beams crashed, and trees split, their crowns ablaze like torches in the hand of a cruel giant. I felt the clothes on my back ready to ignite. The brand on my cheeks scorched, as if the fire within me called to the fire in the air. Move or die, whispered the flames. I dragged Lady Seymour north, then east, away from the course of the wind, which blew like a bellows and fanned the flames. British soldiers looted a burning building, running out with arms full of silver and forks and spoons sticking out of their pockets. A dog ran by howling, its tail on fire. We passed a family, all in their nightclothes, throwing buckets of water against the wall of their house as the fire chewed through the wood. A group of men had harnessed themselves to a fire wagon that held a large tank of water, but one of the wheels broke and it proved too heavy to drag. One more block, and we could go no further. Lady Seymour and me collapsed in a heap on the edge of a graveyard. Time burned up while we lay there, caught in the sparks that flew overhead, swallowed by the noise of a city ablaze. When I finally came to my senses, I sat up, coughed at length, and breathed in slow. It hurt, but it would not be the death of me. Lady Seymour still lay beside me, shaking her head from side to side in the dirt and muttering. I bent my ears close to her. "The bells! Where are the bells?" she asked. Had the fire ruined her mind? Why worry about the bells? "You're safe, ma'am," I said, patting her hand. She frowned. "Why don't the bells ring alarm?" Her words were garbled, like she was talking underwater, but I finally ever understood. Every bell in every church steeple should have been ringing loud and fearsome, but they were all gone, melted and reformed into cannons. I stood up. Over the rooftops, I could see men pouring water on the flattish roof of St. Paul's, the buckets handed to them from a long line of people that stretched to a backyard pump. To the south, tiny Trinity Church was not as lucky. Its tall steeple was a pyramid of fire, the flames licking the undersides of the clouds that scuttled above. "What shall we do, ma'am?" I asked. Her tears turned black as they rolled through the soot on her face. Her left arm and leg lay limp, as if some cog within her head snapped. She did not make a sound. 'Twas up to me to make the decisions. "Come," I helped her to sit. "We need to make our way to safety." I stood to her left, draped the useless arm over my neck, and held her body tight to mine. In that manner, step by slow step, we staggered on. We passed countless people standing in the streets like statues, their toes bare on the stones, nightclothes blowing in the unnatural breeze, mouths agape. Carts rolled by carrying half-naked people, bleeding and dazed. A collection of charred bodies had been stacked on a corner, not fully covered by a blanket. A child's boot and stocking lay in the gutter, next to an overturned rain barrel. Step by slow step, we made our way to Wall Street, then down to 7th Street on the left. She was near insensible by the time we reached it. In truth, I pinched her as hard as I could. It roused her some, and she lifted her working leg. Thus, we mounted the steps of the Lockton house and entered the front door. Chapter 32. Sunday, September 22nd to Thursday, September 26th, 1776. Our distresses were very great indeed before, but this disaster has increased them tenfold. Many hundreds of families have lost their all, and are reduced from a state of affluence to the lowest ebb of want and wretchedness, destitute of shelter, food, or clothing. New York Mercury newspaper. Near 500 homes were destroyed that night, plus shops, churches, and stables. Thousands of people were homeless, without even a change of underclothes or clean stockings. Many did not eat meat for weeks on account of the death smell that poisoned the air. The job of finding bodies was so gruesome it caused grown men to scream out loud. They buried the dead quickly. Folks said the fire started in a low groggery near the Whitehall slip. From there, it burned uptown, pushed by a strong wind, devouring Bridge Street, Dock, Stone Market Field, and Beaver. Then it ran up both sides of Broadway. Almost every building from Broadway to the edge of North River was in ruins, all the way up to the open field below King's College. They called it the burned-over district. "God's judgment on the British," whispered the patriots. "Rebel sabotage," shouted the loyalists. Most figured the Americans wanted New York burned to the ground to leave the British without shelter. While the fire still raged, groups of soldiers searched for arsonists. One man, found with rosin and brimstone-tipped slivers of wood in his pocket, was tossed into a burning cobbler's shop. Another was quickly executed with a bayonet through the chest. Half a dozen people were hung while the fire still raged, one from a signpost of a tavern. Another was hung from his heels and had his throat slashed. The day after the fire, they captured a schoolteacher named Nathan Hale, up island near the Dove Tavern. He admitted he was a spy, but said he did not set the fire. There was no trial, no proof of his guilt. They put a rope around his neck and hung him high. Folks talked about a pretty speech he gave afore they kicked the stool away from his feet. He said he was sorry that he could die only one time for his country. The lobsterbacks laughed at that. I coughed up mouthfuls of soot for days. My eyes felt crusted with embers. No matter how much I rubbed them or rinsed them with clean water, they remained swole up, red and hard to see out of. I was lucky. I was not killed or burnt. I had not even twisted an ankle running from the flames. All I lost in the confusion was Ruth's doll. All I had lost was everything. My bees swarmed back into my brain pan. They hummed loud, so I need not ponder on the baby doll. The burned over district looked like the inside of me. It was hard to tell where one stopped and the other started. I feared my wits had been melted by the flames, twisted and charred. Dr. Dastage came to examine Lady Seymour. The left side of her body had gone to sleep and would not wake. The doctor said it was apoplexy, brought on by the fire. He bled her twice and prescribed Meredith's drops to cleanse her blood. Master Lockton insisted his aunt should recover in the bedchamber he shared with his wife. Madame was not pleased with the arrangement, but said nothing, for a change. She visited the ruins of the Seymour house daily, waiting for them to cool enough so that she could poke through the ash with a hoe in search of coin or melted silver. Lady Seymour called me to her bedside when she regained her senses. She tried to thank me, but the affliction pulled at her mouth and made it hard to figure her words. I gave her the portrait of the yellow-haired man and the letters that I had stuffed in my pocket as we fled. She studied them close with her good eye. Then she sobbed, and both her eyes overran with tears. Madame bade me leave the room. By the third day after the fire, the Lockton house was packed tighter than a barrel of salt cod and smelled worse. We had been invaded again. Many of the rebel houses that were occupied by the British Army had burned to the ground. Soldiers found themselves as homeless as regular folk, so their commanders ordered that anyone with an undamaged home share it with the men. We wound up with 11 fellows from Kent sleeping 3 to a bedchamber and using the second-floor drawing room as their common area for dining and conversating. The master and madam moved their bedchamber to the downstairs front parlor and gave the library over to Colonel Hawkins, a high-ranking officer whose favor Lockton sought. The cellar was turned into barracks for 5 soldiers who had their wives with them. This was the Lord's blessing on me because the women were used to cooking and cleaning for their men's regiment. The new boss lady in the kitchen was named Sarah, a black-haired gal with a baby in her belly. She was not a friendly sort, none of them were, but she did not call me names nor seemed inclined to hand out beatings. I did miss Becky Berry more than I thought possible. It was odd sleeping in the cellar with strangers. They sure did snore, the women as bad as the men. Their bodies gave off noxious odors, too, gases so strong they made my eyes water. The night of the first frost, I woke up to a soldier pulling off my blanket. I lay in the dark, fists clenched and teeth sharp, thinking he might do me harm. He did not. He was simply cold and in need of another layer of cloth. Next morning, Sarah agreed I could move my pallet up to the kitchen hearth. It was lonely sleeping without that fool doll. Chapter 33. Friday, September 27th to Saturday, November 16th, 1776. The autumn passed in a dog-weary haze for me, with much work and little time left to ponder or breathe. Everything was cloaked in gray: oyster gray, charcoal gray, pewter gray, mold gray, storm gray, and ash. Scraps of ash floated through the air for weeks and found their way into everything, from butter to tea. The rains turned the ash to mud. Frost painted the ground the color of a gravestone, ashes trapped in ice. I flaked ashy too. Mama used to rub a salve of bear fat and mint on us as winter approached so our skin would not dry and crack. Was Ruth's skin dry? Did anyone notice? Ashes drifted into the hollow places in my bones and silted up my brain pan. I had the fanciful notion that perhaps we had died in the fire, that we were all lost souls, forbidden to enter heaven. When I had low thoughts like that, Curzon's voice would call me from my rememory and tell me to join him, to become a rebel. I told that voice to hush. With the ash so thick inside and out, I had few thoughts to spare for that fool. I figured he was dug in with the troops at Fort Washington, which seemed a good place, what with the strong walls and cannons protecting it. Folks said the British wouldn't attack the fort until spring. The men drilled and patrolled. Sarah and the other soldier wives spent most of their days down at the campground doing the chores for the regiment, washing clothes in big iron pots and cooking whatever could be found to roast or stew. They did some tidying at the Lockton house and kept the officers fed, too. The dirtiest jobs fell to me: water hauling, wood chopping, and chamber pot emptying. On top of that, Colonel Hawkins claimed me for his errand girl, sending me out with messages for this captain or that sergeant in search of snuff or hair powder or almonds. He was terrible fond of almonds. By the time the apples were harvested, hundreds of ships crammed with expensive British goods crowded the docks. The price of food doubled and doubled again. This did not affect the Locktons nor the rich Loyalist refugees who streamed into the city toting bags of gold. We took delivery of enough potatoes to fill the bin in the cellar and had no trouble buying meat. But regular folks burnt out of their homes and penniless Loyalists, refugees on the run from the rebels, they were forced to shelter in Canvastown, the new name for the burned over district. They used tent canvas to make huts against the standing chimneys and half crumbled brick walls. They ate beans and rice when they were lucky and begged on the streets when they were not. One day I noticed that the plants grown from Mama's seeds had been killed by the frost, the stalks dead on the ground with shriveled paper leaves. A lump of mud stuck in my throat. I had forgotten to care for them. I collected the few seeds left from the flower heads and wrapped them in a scrap of cloth that I laid under the loose board in the pantry, where I had hidden my silver of lead from the king's statue. As the weather turned colder, Lady Seymour's mind cleared and her body strengthened. She could walk with help and move the crippled arm some, but her mouth still dragged at the corner and her speech was still hard to follow. Madame was not entirely pleased that her husband's aunt was mending. I heard her grumble to Lockton that the old biddy will just never die, just to spite us. A month or so after the fire, I was setting down a clean pitcher of water in Lady Seymour's bedchamber, whilst Madame read the newspaper aloud to her. I thought the lady was dozing, but her eyes snapped open when Madame described how British soldiers had looted the City Hall library. They stole books, ruined paintings, and broke scientific equipment stored there by the professors of the King's College. Lady Seymour made Madame repeat the entire story, then demanded pen and ink and paper, fighting her way out from the blankets with her good arm. Once dressed warmly and settled at the writing table, she composed a strongly worded letter about the library destruction to General Howe, Supreme Commander of the Royal Forces, and called for a glass of brandy and a bowl of soup. After that, it fell to me to walk with Lady Seymour along Wall Street on days when the sun was strong. She hired 3 seamstresses to sew her a new wardrobe and included a heavy skirt and thick woolen cloak for me in that order. I protested that I could not pay for the clothes, but Lady Seymour simply pointed to the portrait of the yellow-haired man, her husband, on the mantel and his letters stacked next to it. "We will not discuss payment again," she said slowly. "Thank you, ma'am," I said. After the pigs had been slaughtered and fresh pork was for sale in the market, another wave of British officers moved in and set up their camp beds in the second-floor drawing room. The long dining table was covered end to end with maps. The men would stand over them, chins in their hands, trying to figure out how to finish off the rebels. They were now scheming to finish the war in time for the new year. Battles and skirmishes were fought on the north part of the New York Island, though the city was safe. Whilst they plotted Washington's downfall, I dozed in a chair in the hallway in case they needed victuals or a bottle of port. Sleep was a rare and precious thing to me in those days. The next day I was yawning hard as I trudged up to the tea-water pump. The November wind carried the promise of snow, and I was glad for the new cloak Lady Seymour had given me. Soon I would need rags to wrap around my hands. My muddled head did not register the great hullabaloo at first, but then my ears awoke. Folks were shouting and hurrying towards the Greenwich Road where it dumped out onto the commons. I was not sure what the race was for, but I lifted my skirts and joined along with it. "They got 'em!" cheered a red-faced man, throwing both of his arms into the air. "They got 'em all!" By the time I made it to the commons, I had to fight my way to the front of the cheering mob. The end of the Greenwich Road was lined with British soldiers, relaxed and laughing at their prisoners. Captured American soldiers walked 3 to a row between their enemies through the doors of Bridewell Prison. "Was there a battle?" I asked a serving girl next to me. "Up the fort," she said. "Them Hessians killed lots. Blood was running like water, they said. They fired them cannons from the ships, blew arms and legs everywhere, heads too." I nodded, unable to think what I should say. A chant started in the crowd and singing. I did not join in, nor did I throw clods of mud as many did, including the bloodthirsty girl next to me. The rebels kept coming in, row after filthy row, most with their heads down, some limping with a crutch or an arm in a sling. Their uniforms were torn and tattered. A few walked barefoot over the icy cobblestones, flinching when hit square with mud or a rock. They carried neither flag nor weapons. Their breath billowed like they were hard-ridden horses. It hung around their heads like smoke. It was towards the end of the line, with the other enlisted slaves, his head bent forward, his face invisible. A bloody bandage was tied above his right knee, and it looked painful to step with his right foot. The only way I knew him was that hat, nearer brown than red now, with the rip through the brim and the ring in his ear. The guard shoved the last of the prisoners, including the boy with the red-brown hat, through the door of the prison and closed them with a loud metal clang.